Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Wise Ass by Tom Mccaffrey, narrated by Joe Barrett. Prologue. Early Days. I promise not to bore you with a tedious recitation of my formative years, but as you will see later, this one thing is important, so pay attention. I've always had an affinity for animals. As I think back on it at an incredibly early age, I've formed a subconscious connection between animals and women. When I was 4, Kathy Brown, a cute 5-year-old brunette with large green eyes, who lived in the next apartment of our building in the high-bridge section of the Bronx, took me down into the alleyways to assist her in playing doctor to what I later realized were dead pigeons that we found there. I was an orderly who scoured the labyrinthian alleyways the length of the block with a wagon and collected and returned with the birds to the designated spot. There, Kathy would wrap them in tissue paper and place them in shoeboxes lined along a wall as if they were sleeping patients in a hospital ward. She squirted a few drops of some liquid she carried in her pocket into the beaks of each of these lifeless animals. The apparent efficacy of her treatment was reinforced by the fact that, when we returned to the same spot the following day, the birds in their beds were nowhere to be found. I spent a lot of time trying to match up the living pigeons I would later spot on the street with the patients we had cured the day before. On a good day, we saved a dozen patients. At the end of each arduous shift in the avian medical ward, Kathy Brown would lead me by the hand out of the subterranean darkness, and before my eyes had adjusted to the daylight, peck me on the cheek and skip off towards her apartment. The resulting tingling was worth the risk of catching any of the numerous diseases I encountered each shift. Both kisses and germs did wonders for my immune system. You never forget your first crush. This method of hard-wiring wasn't without its problems, which I proved later that same year when my poor, very pregnant mother walked me and the rest of her animated brood home from McCombs Park. My preternaturally responsible older sister led our Irish caravan, holding my older brother's hand while I grasped tightly to the street side of the pram carrying my younger brother. I remember being fascinated by his bobbing mob of bright red curls, since the rest of us were all brunettes, and my older brother had told me that gingers have no souls. Time would tell. My mother herded us along, heading south under the L on the park side of Jerome Avenue, with her alternating combinations of threats and promised treats. My older brother, who I now suspect fell somewhere on the Asperger scale, brought the caravan to a sudden halt when he squatted down in the middle of the sidewalk and studied an army of ants that had commandeered the last of a Baby Ruth bar that someone had dropped. Having grown bored with watching my ginger sibling, my attention shifted to Jerome Avenue and the overhead squealing of a southbound No. 4 train pulling into the Yankee Stadium station. At the ding-dong ping sound of its opening doors, my eyes followed the disturbed descending flock of pigeons gliding down from the guano-covered steel girders of the L to sample the last of a patch of flattened crackerjack on Jerome 10 feet away. I scanned the group to see if any of them were recent patients. With a firm "Stay put," my mother locked the pram's wheels and advanced to the front of the caravan, where she reached down and lifted my older brother back to standing position and gave him and my sister a slight shove on the bottoms to propel them past this latest distraction. My ears perked up at the swelling engine roar of an enormous Mack truck approaching from behind us. The bobbing circle of the pigeons continued unfazed to peck and pry at the tacky mass of caramel-covered popcorn as if they were searching for the famous prize. Without thinking, a recurring issue in my life, I released my grip on the pram and raced out into the southbound lane of Jerome Avenue towards the birds, waving my arms frantically as I tried to shoo them out of harm's way. I barely noticed the banshee wail that rose from my mother's lips or the screeching metal of the Mack truck brakes mixed with its sonorous horn behind me. The pigeons defiantly held their ground until I stuck a 2-footed landing in the middle of their feeding scrum, at which point they rose in unison back towards their overhead steel perches, encircling me in a feathered magician's curtain. Having saved the flock, I turned towards the family caravan. who had all turned their faces away from me. As I turned back toward the street, I noticed, in what my memory recorded in slow motion, that the oncoming traffic in the northbound lane had slowed to a crawl, and I fixated on the horror in the eyes of the cabbie passing to my left. The heat of a steam blast furnace on my back and the hissing sounds of releasing air brakes brought me eye to eye with the dirty white metal bulldog and an oversized cursive group of letters I later learned had spelled Mac, rocking to a slow stop. The slam of a heavy truck door prefaced the large black man who appeared from around the front end of the truck, tapping his chest while wiping rivulets of sweat from his face with a large white handkerchief. He leaned against the truck as if about to faint and stammered, "Are you okay?" Before I could respond, I heard my mother alliterate, "I'm so sorry, sir," before yanking my collar backward with such force that my feet rose like a kite's tail traveling in the air behind me. I landed on my backside and continued skidding backwards until I came to rest against the oversized wheels of the pram. I looked up to see the contorted face of my mother, who now grabbed me by my front collar and lifted me with a strength I never knew she possessed, confirmed by a powerful swat to my backside that propelled me through the air into the waiting arms of my sister at the front of the pram. "Now move!" my mother commanded. My older brother had replaced me by the ginger, so my sister grabbed my wrists and tugged me forward while the pram wheels squeaked. I heard my mother mumble her most threatening mantra, "Wait till your father gets home." By Christmas that year, we had moved far away from the run-down apartments near Yankee Stadium to a delightful house in an upscale residential community where I would be less tempted to save what my dad called flying rats on busy streets. As I grew older, I nurtured my empathy for animals by adopting stray dogs and cats, and whatever injured, more exotic suburban wildlife I would come across in my adventures in the neighboring wooded areas. The more grievously injured beasts were patched up by my father, who had been a medic in the Navy during the Korean War and put more than a few stitches in me and my siblings, which explains my lifelong aversion to doctors. If my feral patients survived, they convalesced in a large wooden box in the corner of my room. The multi-generational family members that inhabited the large house begrudgingly accepted the dogs and cats who, with few exceptions, lived out long and happy lives as domesticated additions to our clan. However, as soon as the recuperating wildlife were well enough to escape my room and explore the rest of the house, always seeming to surprise my poor mother in the process, I was forced to discharge them from my infirmary and back into the wild. During their extended runs, squirrels, raccoons, mice, rats, birds, and even snakes passed through my surgery, taking years off my mother's life. Being that this was the Bronx in the 1960s, I never had much contact with the larger species of animals, with one exception. An old man that the kids in my neighborhood called Junkie drove the last of the large wooden Weber wagons, led by an old mule, through our neighborhood on the weekly garbage pickup days. The mule wore cracked leather blinders to mask his view of the mechanized traffic, and his thick brown coat carried a patina of oily grit that spewed from the exhausts of passing automobiles. The melody from the long string of rusty tin cowbells along the front of the wagon kept syncopated time with the bass sounds of the mule's metal horseshoes clopping on the asphalt. Chunky was thin and diminutive in stature, and his skin leathered from a lifetime of exposure to the sun. He wore the same tattered brown suit over a stained long-sleeved shirt buttoned to the collar. The frayed creases in his trousers barely reached the tops of his scarred military boots. His face, framed by a floppy old gray fedora, was angular and creased, and his eyes had epicanthic folds that made him look Mongolian. His exotic derivation was reinforced by the undecipherable litany of what had to be curses streaming past the ubiquitous Marlboro in his lips whenever the rambunctious neighborhood urchins, myself included, would spring out of some driveway and run alongside of his wagon, taunting Junkie and his mule. That all ended one garbage day when my paternal grandfather, we called him Spaghetti, forced me to help him drag an old dead Frigidaire from the back of our garage out to the front of the house. He could have done this by himself, as he was a beast of a man who had hauled 100-pound tins of tar up onto rooftops well into his 80s, but he had an ulterior motive that day. We sat in the old white fridge while he smoked Prince Albert in his pipe, until the growing cacophony of cowbells and horseshoes signaled Junkie's pending arrival from around the corner. Spaghetti stood and waved familiarly to Junkie, and as the wagon drew along the front of the house, my grandfather addressed Junkie in his strange guttural language. Junkie smiled, for the one and only time in my memory, displaying a couple of faux gold teeth tarnished by a lifetime of tobacco juice. They laughed together like Easter conspirators, and Junkie pointed towards where I remained frozen on the fridge. Spaghetti nodded, and Junkie hooked the reins and leaped off his clapboard perch with the agility of a squirrel monkey. Before I could flee, he grabbed my biceps, gently lifted me off the fridge, and set me down on my feet beside it. I was in 4th grade at the time, but was already his height. Without a word, Junkie snatched the top end of the fridge and dragged it towards the back of his wagon. I looked over at Spaghetti, who waved me off and walked toward the front where the mule had turned to face him. I looked back as the imp of a man deftly tilted the fridge against the dropped back gate of the wagon, and reaching down with one fluid movement, heaved the heavy metal monolith from the street deep into the wooden cargo bed. When I turned to see if Spaghetti had witnessed this Herculean effort, I saw him gently stroking the animal's muzzle and whispering something unintelligible in its ear while the animal nodded. Then Spaghetti kissed the animal on its snout before chucking it affectionately under its chin. The animal stole one final glance at Spaghetti before responding to the tug of its reins by the remounted Junkie. After another short, indecipherable exchange, Junkie waved to Spaghetti, lightly shook the reins, and the mule carried them off. "I didn't know you spoke Mongolian," I said incredulously. "That's feckin' Irish, you wee moron," he said with a laugh. "And one more thing. Don't let me catch you or your aged friends bothering that man or his mule again, or I'll cut your feckin' heads off." After Bozzy McCarroll's near decapitation by Spaghetti's stealthy shrub shears the summer before, my friends and I took my grandfather's threat very seriously, so Junkie rode out the remainder of his days through my neighborhood in peace. Once puberty struck, my interests understandably shifted away from childhood fantasies to the more mundane and legitimate pursuits of girls, drinking, and fighting. Despite these sophomoric distractions, over the next 2 decades, I surprisingly managed to meet and marry the woman of my dreams and maintain decent enough grades to find my way through upper academia and into law school. There I graduated close enough to the top of my class to land a lucrative job with a prestigious Wall Street law firm. And that's where my problems really started. Chapter 1. Professional Confessions. I'd like to tell you that my success as a lawyer came because of my superior intellect, but that would be bullshit. I've always been an average guy with a penchant for procrastination. The truth is that for some strange reason, throughout my professional life, the universe has always stepped in and provided me with whatever legal information, cases, statutes, theories I've ever needed whenever I have needed it. It's like I'm a permanent contestant on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and my lifeline is Clarence Darrow. It wasn't always like that. I didn't have the gift back in law school. I suffered from imposter syndrome, and so I worked my ass off 24/7 for 3 years to avoid a daily panic attack. I worked harder than most of the trust fund legacies that I followed through the law school door that first year. They never broke a sweat because they knew they belonged there and would graduate and take their place in their professional legal pantheon, no matter what they did. Their success was genetically preordained. I, on the other hand, was born with dirt under my fingernails. I was the first one in my family to complete college, never mind go on to graduate school. My grandparents were raised on farms on the other side of the pond and were lucky to complete grade school. They came to this country at the turn of the last century to work as supers, doormen, housekeepers, nannies, and cooks for the ancestors of my law school classmates. Hell, the only book I ever saw my grandfather, Spaghetti, read was Steinbeck's The Red Pony. So I entered law school 5 rungs down on society's evolutionary ladder and was hanging on for dear life. My reward for pure tenaciousness was landing a second-year lottery interview with the Wall Street version of Pygmalion's Henry Higgins. He was a senior partner at a white shoe law firm who, in an apparent fit of whimsy, decided that my obvious Neanderthal DNA might come along with a heightened killer instinct. He was right. Once employed, I was the rookie who, right out of the gate, was sent all over the country to take and defend the toughest depositions. I didn't give a shit who was sitting across the conference room table from me. If I wanted information from their witness, I kept at them until I got it. If I wanted to prevent the other side from prying information out of our witnesses, I shut them down. I once reached under the table and thumped my own witness in the nuts to keep him from completing what was starting out to be an unbelievably bad admission. Before long, I second-sat a couple of trials because I was always able to whisper the right thought in the ear of the white-haired partner I was squiring. I didn't care that they got the accolades. I was also the associate my law firm trotted out to discreetly spring their high-power clients' children, spouses, and valued employees from jail. Having gotten to where I was on luck and sweat, I had no professional ego and innately understood that the criminal courthouse is really run by the clerks and the court officers, not the judges, and certainly not the lawyers. In fact, I grew up with many of these plebeians, so we spoke the same working-class dialect. If you could connect with them on their own level, that was half the battle. Many white shoe lawyers learned the hard way that you piss them off at your peril. It was during one of my Friday night runs to arraignment court that I first met Dan Pearsall. He was a huge black man in his late 30s who resembled Isaac Hayes. He was sitting alone, reading a copy of The Hollywood Reporter in the back bench area of the courtroom bleachers, filled with the usual Friday night crowd of worried parents, spouses, and children, stage whispering with their respective defendants' legal aid or 18B lawyers, waiting anxiously for the calendar call. Dan Pearsall looked remarkably cool, sitting there amongst the damned. Luckily, my boy Mike Moulton was the clerk on duty in the courtroom that night. Mike was sitting at his industrial desk, stage right in the front of the gallery, studiously ignoring the gathering line of attorneys, impatiently waiting to learn if their client's file lay somewhere in the 2-foot stack on Mike's desk. They knew that if the file wasn't there, their client was spending the rest of the weekend as a guest of the state in the Manhattan Tombs or Rikers Island. Mike saw me approaching down the center aisle. He stood up and met me at the court rail, while the other waiting attorneys mumbled their haughty displeasure. "Who do you got tonight, Jimmy?" Mike asked. "Jonas Williams III, a little pussy from Greenwich, who got pinched in a buy-in bus this afternoon trying to score some coke. His dad is a major client of the firm." Mike was a bit of a savant when it came to his job, and I watched with amusement as he closed his eyes for a few seconds and placed his left hand to his forehead, mimicking the amazing Kreskin as he ran the names in his stack of files through his prodigious memory bank. "Yeah, I got him. Hold on." Mike returned to his desk and reached into the stack about 3/4 down and deftly retrieved young Jonas' file without causing the precarious pile to topple. He quickly scanned it, gently placed it on top of the stack, and returned to me. "They are charging him with possession under 220.03, he whispered. "Shit. This is his first offense, and his daddy's heart is set on seeing his boy graduate from law school. Any chance the ADA will drop it down to a violation if we plead tonight?" "I doubt it," Mike said. "That douchebag Douglas is handling the calendar." "Damn it," I replied. Samuel Douglas was a little prick of an ADA, whose vindictiveness was only surpassed by his bitterness at being relegated to regularly handling night arraignments. Once a rising star in the Manhattan District Attorney's office, he got caught by a judge withholding exculpatory Brady material in a homicide case. Since they couldn't prove enough intent to warrant his firing, Douglas' penance was to suffer a year in night court purgatory. Since misery loves company, No Deal Douglas made sure that nobody was happy when he was handling arraignments. Mike leaned in. "How important is this kid to you?" "Personally, not at all. Professionally, very." "Leave it with me," Mike said, as he tapped the side of his nose with his forefinger. He walked back towards his desk, still ignoring the now lengthy line of lawyers vying for his attention, grabbed the file off the top of his stack, and walked through the large bronze door directly to the left of the judge's bench. Before I could find a seat among my legal brethren on the first bench, the bronze door flew open to the sound of Mike's baritone commanding all rise, while the spectators and shysters all compiled in unison. Following directly behind Mike was Justice George T. Silver, an elderly jurist who was on senior status and enjoyed keeping his hand in the mix by working a few calendars of night arraignments. The judge was carrying my client's file as he assumed his throne on the bench, while Mike retrieved his remaining stack of files and took his place immediately to the judge's left. Stage left of the courtroom, a door quietly opened, and a court officer led a nervous little dipshit in handcuffs into the well of the court. I checked him against the photo I was carrying and confirmed that it was Jonas, while the officer removed his cuffs and directed him to a spot at the defense table. I headed towards my spot beside him as Mike shouted, "People versus Jonas Williams III." Judge Silver looked over at Douglas, who was fumbling with his files, and nodded at me. "Counsel, approach," he commanded, gesturing with his right hand. I was the first to arrive at the bench and went right into my spiel. "Your Honor, this is Mr. Williams' first offense of any kind. He's a good kid from a great family with an excellent future ahead of him. Any hint of a criminal record would ruin that." Douglas interrupted. "The jails are full of good kids, Your Honor, and this one was caught in a clean bust." Judge Silver cut Douglas off. "Was he picked up as part of the annual NYU graduation sweep of Washington Square Park?" "As a matter of fact, Your Honor, he was," I chimed in, smiling over at the flustered Douglas. "Didn't you graduate from NYU, Mr. Douglas?" Judge Silver asked. "Yes, Your Honor," Douglas responded, puffing his chest out just a little. "What a waste of taxpayers' money," Judge Silver said dismissively, waving us back to our positions. "Okay, I've heard enough." When we returned to counsel's table, the judge addressed my client directly. "Mr. Williams, will you promise me that I will never see your face in court again?" My client was startled. I leaned over and whispered, "Say, yes, Your Honor." "Yes, Your Honor," he stammered. The judge jotted something in the file and handed it off to Mike, who took a quick look at it and made his own notation on its jacket before he placed it as the first in a new stack before him. "Well then," the judge continued, "I'm going to adjourn this case in contemplation of dismissal. Mr. Williams, if you can keep your nose clean for the next 6 months, and I mean that in all aspects of that term, I'll dismiss the case and seal your record." Douglas objected. "But, Your Honor—" "Enough, counsel. We have a long night ahead of us." Judge Silver turned to Mike. "Mr. Moulton, call the next case." Jonas looked at me, confused. "What just happened?" "You're done here. Go home," I said, leading him by his elbow out through the swinging gates and down the center aisle towards the exit at the back of the courtroom. Once outside, I handed him a 20. "Use this to buy your ticket back to Greenwich. Do not use it to score drugs, because, trust me, this was a one-time Christmas present. Next time, you're fucked." He nodded. "I won't, I promise. Thank you, Mr. McCarthy, Jimmy McCarthy," I said, patting him on the shoulder. "Well, thank you, Jimmy McCarthy," he said, smiling for the first time. He rubbed his wrists and gazed around with a newfound appreciation for his freedom before heading off into the Manhattan night. I could only hope that he had learned his lesson. Most of these spoiled pricks don't until it's too late. As I turned around to leave, I almost bumped into the massive chest of Dan Pearsall. "Mr. McCarthy," he said, extending a hand that could have doubled for a catcher's mitt. My hand disappeared into this hydraulic compressor, and I was pretty sure his fingertips reached my elbow before one formal shake lifted me to my toes. "You demonstrated some slick moves in there," he said, smiling with a set of pearly whites that would have made a piano proud. "Just another night at the circus," I replied. "Mr. Pearsall, Dan Pearsall," he said. "Jimmy," I said with a slight nod, and began scanning the street in search of a cab. "Well, Dan, I'm glad you enjoyed the show. It was a pleasure meeting you." "Hold on a second, Jimmy," Dan said, his smile losing a bit of its luster. He slid his large frame between me and the curb with an unexpected agility. Night Court isn't a tourist attraction, so Dan's spot among the courtroom spectators meant that he had some business with the penal system. "My boy Doug got swept up in the same Washington Square Park bullshit as the white kid in there." I tried to cut to the chase. "Listen, Dan, I'm an associate at a big firm who does what its partners tell him to do. Tonight they told me to get that rich brat out of jail. I can't freelance." "Well, what if I retain your firm?" He pulled out his wallet and removed $2,000 in Benjamins. The first rule of survival I learned at my law firm was that you never took a call on a Friday from any partner after 5 p.m. if you didn't want to work the weekend. I wasn't about to tempt fate by calling the managing partner on a Friday night to clear this retainer. Funny how small-time bullshit can lead to life-altering decisions. Fuck it. Put your money away. I'm treating this as a one-shot pro bono matter. No guarantees, arraignment only, but if I don't get the judge to adjourn it in contemplation of dismissal, then you have to find someone else to take the case over. Done, Dan said, almost carrying me back through the doors of 80 Center Street. Much to Sam Douglas' consternation, Mike Moulton and I repeated our tag team magic before Judge Silver, and an hour later Dan and Doug Pearsall were happily reunited on the courthouse steps. "Thank you so much, Mr. McCarthy." Doug, a thinner, fairer clone of his dad, gushed. I got the sense that, unlike the earlier Greenwich brat, he really meant it. "No problem, Doug," I said. "Good luck." I turned to Dan. "Listen, it's been real, but I gotta go." "Wait, Jimmy," Dan said. "Can I at least buy you dinner?" "Nah, my wife's waiting dinner for me at home," I said, this time quickly heading out to intercept a northbound taxi. "Fool me once." "I'll call you then," Dan shouted. "We can have lunch." "Sure thing, any time," I said as an afterthought as I hopped into the cab and quickly slammed the door behind me. I half expected his iron grip on my shoulder before I got away, and shuddered with a bewildering sense of relief as the driver pulled into traffic. It wasn't the last time I underestimated Dan Pearsall's tenacity. It turned out that, like Horton the elephant, when Dan Pearsall said something, he meant it. Chapter 2. Lunch, anyone? Big firm practice is basically a gilded cage for an associate. In exchange for signing your life away to toil endlessly from one case to the next, the partners throw so much stupid money at you that it makes it impossible to walk away voluntarily. That doesn't mean associates don't leave. The culling starts with the first annual review, and those few that make it to year 8 face the final up or out decision of partnership or the door. There may be 2 partners in each entering class of 45 new associates. But with egos the size of their paychecks, each novice enters the race thinking they are the front runner. I never suffered from that illusion. The imposter in me always knew that my bell would be rung long before I was offered a seat amongst the Brahmins. The professional futility of life at a Wall Street mega firm isn't as obvious as you would think. That first summer working between second and third year of law school is a textbook example of masterful handling. The work the talent overseers give you is interesting, with flexible enough deadlines that they can constantly interrupt your day with breakfasts and luncheons. They always end it early enough so the youngest, coolest partners can take you to dinner, followed by either a museum exhibit opening, a play, a ball game, or a ballet. The mid-'80s Yankees were in a bit of a rut, so my wife and I opted for the culture immersion route. We even got orchestra seats to see Baryshnikov dance at Lincoln Center. Who could believe a human could have a 3 Mississippi hang time for one grand jeté? LeBron James eats your heart out. New York hardens you. Most people can walk 3 blocks in Midtown Manhattan and literally step over a dozen homeless people without blinking an eye. You know they are there, but you force yourself to ignore them or risk repeated heartbreak at their suffering. That same emotional conditioning allows summer associates to ignore the silent anguish of the real associates. The partners make sure to limit any of your exposure to only those star associates that are clearly on partnership track to ensure that no one tells you the truth. The rest of the drones keep their heads down and get on with feeding the litigation machine and collecting their large paychecks. Their go-to trick is never to make eye contact with the Summers when they pass in the hallways or library. The Summers sense in their gut that something's not right, but they force themselves to ignore it and get on with being courted by the best and the brightest. It's a heady experience. Of course, once having accepted the law firm's offer for full-time employment after graduation, you get to drink the Kool-Aid on the very first day of work. Partners race to dump the heavy lifting for their cases on as many bodies as they can wrangle, knowing each body represents a new source of billable hours that get tallied under their respective scorecards when the firm's profits are divvied up amongst the chosen at the end of each fiscal year.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?